Good morning, everyone. Still a little sleepy this morning. So welcome. I wanted to start this panel by sharing a few findings from this annual look back report from CDR.FYI that I think illustrate where we are right now. So last year, CDR as a whole grew a lot. Sales increased by 78%. But as the report put it, the sector mainly grew on the backs of existing buyers fulfilling their stated commitments. So out of 216 buyers in this database, Microsoft, Google, and Frontier accounted for 80% of the purchases. The number of first-time buyers coming in declined by 18%. And then, on top of that sort of setting, there's the new political environment where under the first Trump administration, there was this major kind of counter reaction from the corporate world, companies saying we're still in and setting net zero targets and starting to buy carbon removal. And now we are starting to see a little bit of the opposite reaction. And I imagine that's pretty worrisome for a lot of people in this room and listening. So today we're going to talk about how to drive demand for CDR and direct air capture within this challenging environment. And we have three great panelists. We have Brian DiMarino, the Managing Deputy Director of Global Sustainability at JP Morgan, Julius Groot, who works on strategic partnerships at Climeworks, and Adam Fraser, the CEO of Terraset, which, if you haven't heard of it yet, is a nonprofit that pools philanthropic donations to buy and scale carbon removal. So to start off the panel, I wanted to start with Julius on the end there. How has the market for direct air capture changed in the last 2 years? We all met here 2 years ago. What's been going on?
A lot has changed, actually. In my opinion, what has changed is the motivation for actually moving into the space. I think up until 2-3 years ago, or maybe a bit longer, really the primary motivation was to create a big headline. And now you see, due to this new political environment, but also how the market has changed, is that companies actually no longer want to do this, and they actually really, think about how can we integrate this in our day-to-day operations as a company, how can we make sure that it's aligned with our business intensive and business narratives. And therefore, in my role at Climeworks, I mainly work with companies and really finding out where does CDR, direct air capture in specific, where does it sit in their sustainability strategies. And therefore, this pivot has been interesting in finding out, hey, what is an argument or what are multiple arguments that actually land for them internally?
What about in the last few months? In your conversations with buyers, have things shifted at all just since the election or since the inauguration?
As you can hear, I'm not American, I'm European, and what I've learned over the last few months, what has changed is that there needs to be money needs to be made. If you want to convince a company, a CFO of a large organization, they need to understand, is this either going to be a cost or can we actually win something from this? And therefore, you really, really have to deep dive in, is that, for example, angles of trading, or is it angles of other ways? I think it's really, really important that you sit together with these people and really understand what do they hope to achieve, and there build on that.
Brian, what about you? What has changed for you since you first started buying carbon removal? Are you doing anything differently?
I don't know if we're doing anything differently. Everything that you just mentioned has changed, right? So I think we need to be very aware. If anyone has heard me speak, first of all, I'm sorry, but we tend to speak in these sort of echo chambers, if you will. And so this room is a good example. We are all people who care about this topic, who understand it pretty well, maybe very well. We all want to see it succeed, et cetera, et cetera. But I think you get one or two concentric circles away from that world, and people don't really understand exactly what this is and how important it is, and et cetera. And so I think like I said, nothing's really changed for us. We're still on the journey that we were on. We're still focused on acquiring CDR for all of our Scope 1 emissions. We still buy nature-based solutions for all of our Scope 3 unabated emissions. We're still on that journey. But I think what certainly has changed is the conversations that we're having more broadly with clients, with project developers, with sort of everyone in the industry, this recognition, what Phil pointed out, or what Julius pointed out, which is that the moral imperative will not win the day. There has to be an economic incentive for people to move. We have been very fortunate as a financial institution that there is an economic imperative. For us, we can bank these companies, so we do that, right? So we've raised money for Climeworks, we've raised money for Heirloom, we've got large project finance conversations going on. So there is sort of something beyond just the purchase, and one of the ways we've been sort of advancing this conversation is to be able to show those proof points internally to say, we are getting things done and it is showing a return. Is it paying back what we've paid yet? Not yet, but there is some amount of an offset in the P&L, and I think that's been helpful for us to continue to advance the discussion.
What about your criteria as a buyer? As far as I'm aware, Climeworks is the only DAC company that you've purchased from so far, JP Morgan. What would get you to sign a deal with one of the companies that's here today?
I would just point out, we are members of Frontier, so we've also purchased through them additional DAC projects. I think one of the biggest challenges for us is not the criteria, right? Like our criteria is actually very, it's publicly stated. If you haven't seen it, you can see it. We published our criteria when we did the first CDR purchases back in 2023. I think one of the things that has maybe changed a little bit for us is, or not changed for us, but that we're trying to manage, is that we have a very small scope 1 footprint in relative terms, so it's 100,000 tons. So if we do, 10,000 tons here, 20,000 tons there, very quickly we chew through that and we can't do more. And so we're trying to be very selective, that we're working with companies that are relatively early stage, that we know we can help them be successful. So it's hard to actually, it's funny, I'm gonna say this cautiously, but we almost wish we had more emissions, because then you can do more work in this space, but we can't. And we very purposely ring-fenced our engineered removal purchases to scope 1, because it helped us to manage the sort of internal noise around, well, how big is this gonna get? And when we're able to say, look, 1, we're most accountable for scope 1, 2, we're willing to spend the most money to abate emissions there, so it sets a marginal cost of abatement that's higher than anything else we would do. So that stuff has kind of been important for us, but the criteria itself hasn't actually changed overall. I do think you're gonna see that companies start looking to overweight lower dollar per ton solutions, but to me that would be in support of the higher dollar stuff, right? So you're gonna see larger purchases of lower dollar per ton stuff and smaller purchases of higher dollar per ton. I still think that's okay. If you're selling at a higher dollar per ton, you might disagree, but I think this is all about sort of advancing the conversation in whole. So I think that focus on the dollars is gonna be very, very important.
Adam, what about you? What is your criteria? How do you kind of approach the market as a buyer?
I think our criteria as a 501c3 that only exists to try and scale this sector, our criteria are what you would expect as the standard things for the sector: additional, verifiable, scalable, catalytic, etc., but with a real focus on looking to the future. It doesn't matter that much to us what price we're paying today. It matters what the sector looks like in a few years. And I think you would probably say the same thing. Most buyers would say the same thing. We're buying carbon removal now with a view to the price coming down so the sector can scale. I think as these two have touched on, what's interesting is what people's motivations will be as part of that journey now, and especially in the current environment. I was talking to someone the other day at a major business who said, we still want to do this, but I'm trying to figure out where it sits. Is this now my sustainability budget? Because will I have to report here? I'm not talking about it anymore. I'm actively keeping it quiet, so it's not my marketing and PR budget. Is this philanthropy? Should I be talking to Terraset about doing this from a philanthropic perspective? I said yes. But I think it's really not just people's criteria for making a purchase that matter now, but really getting behind their motivation. And I think that is going to vary more and more company to company and individual person you're speaking to individual person. I think you would agree, Julius, it has been so key to find an internal champion at a company who drives things forward, like this guy. But to scale that is hard work, and so that's what the industry has ahead of it in the next few years.
I want to come back to that in just a second, but I also wanted to ask you, so how do you kind of develop, people talk about a carbon removal portfolio. With Terraset, how are you kind of prioritizing where you're putting your money, how much DAC are you buying versus other types of carbon removal?
That's a really good question that I think transparency is really important in this sector, so I'll give the real answer, not the answer I sometimes think I should come up with. We were not that strategic when we started putting our portfolio together. We were looking at the applications that came to us for funding, we were analyzing them against our criteria, but we didn't set a strategic goal of this much DAC, this much biochar, BECCS, whatever, pick your poison. We were very focused on what comes through, what's assessed well, what feels like the right fit. From a DAC perspective, that's had a really, I suppose, a positive impact on our portfolio, because we have 11 companies, and it's 5 or 6 of them are DAC companies. As we keep growing that portfolio, we have a lot of conversations about should we focus on particular methodologies, like should we do a round of purchases in Q2 this year that is purely focused on ocean-based work or BECCS. We haven't really come to a strong decision on that yet, because we think all of these technologies, solutions, methodologies need to scale. So it doesn't really matter if we're over-indexed on one or another, but we do fundamentally believe we'll need multiple examples of multiple different methodologies that in our portfolio, yes, but more importantly on a sector basis.
Both Brian and Adam, I'm curious, when you're considering new companies to purchase carbon removal from, are you mostly, are you working with a third-party consultant? Are you kind of meeting people at conferences like this? Are people coming to you? How are people getting on your radar?
So for us, I guess when you're a large company with I don't want to say a household name, but a well-known name, and you announce something like you're spending a lot of money in a particular area, people tend to show up. So we've been spoiled, I'll say, in the number of companies that have come to us and asked us to, look at them and purchase from them ultimately. And so actually one of the hardest things for us to do is kind of weed through all that. And I feel a little bit like, the Harvard admissions office. It's like, how do you find the ones you really want when there's so many really good ones? And that's hard. But yeah, for us, it kind of is, it's natural.
Yeah, for us as well, inbound interest has been really strong. We have 11 projects in our portfolio, as I said. We've had well over 100 people apply to us for funding, and that keeps coming in. That's inbound interest. I'm very conscious of, you don't know what you don't know. So we think, wow, we've got all these companies coming in, but, what about maybe the game-changing solution that doesn't know where to reach out, which is why conversations like this are so key. We've done those assessments in-house. We have purchased a small amount through Frontier, through Stripe climate orders, but mostly we've done our assessments in-house, and we have direct purchase relationships with the suppliers on the ground. I think that's a really, building on that is a really interesting topic for the sector of what else happens, which air miners are looking at building a buyers group for the kind of, which I think they defined the other day. I heard them say, frontier for the rest of us. I was in Canada a couple of weeks ago for CDR Day, and Ed Whittingham there's looking at building an AMC. There's people like Noah Dyke looking at a global AMC. So people are looking at these different collective buying, that's the wrong term, but looking at these different solutions. And I think more and more of those things will come to the table if they help bring more buyers to the table. And for us, again, as a nonprofit, that also extends to individuals. The majority of our funding is coming from individuals, family offices, et cetera. They don't need to do that from a corporate target setting perspective. They just fundamentally care about there being fewer greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and seeing this sector scale. And so, again, everyone's motivations are different, and they're looking for different ways to engage.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more in depth about motivation and what the value proposition is right now for buying carbon removal, and particularly direct air capture, which is, as we all know, the most expensive form. Julius, what are you finding is the most salient argument with companies right now, in this environment of sort of green hushing where companies aren't necessarily wanting to even market the fact that they're buying carbon removal? Like, why else would they want to buy it?
I think what a lot of companies or maybe senior managers who actually execute or have set net zero targets for their companies don't realize that when you set a net zero target, you actually immediately already sign up for carbon removal, so you have to. I think for direct air capture, everything also that's going on in this political environment, the words that we're hearing of energy transition and American energy dominance, labor force upskilling, I think that's a lot of arguments that actually still do resonate with this specific technology. But apart from that, I think the key is just permanence. For a lot of companies, yes, it is, of course, it is the most expensive option, but you are really future-proofing your strategy against anything that might be incoming. So yes, it is more expensive, but is it also, it's the most proven, it's the highest quality and the most permanent solution that is currently out there.
But like that's always been the case, right? And I think that's what's gotten direct air capture to where it is today, is that argument of, it's measurable and it's permanent. But if companies are sort of on the fence about even spending money on this at all, or they're going to be pushed more towards looking for kind of the cheapest solutions, is there anything else, is there any other way to sell this, to convince buyers that, no, actually, it is in your interest to invest in direct air capture?
I mean, two things to that. Firstly, you need, Adam, as you were saying as well, you need these champions, right? And Brian, I do hope that you realize what kind of incremental impact you had on this entire industry as a whole. But you did with JPM a few years ago was absolutely, massively, massively important. Second to that is, in order to drive these things forward, you have to have people like Brian, but you need to optimize for the dollar that you can spend. And what I see has differed over the last, let's say, 2 years is that people now actually, they opt for impact rather than volume. I mean, if you have an X amount of budget, carbon neutrality, of course, claiming that has lost its value over the last few years. So what you can now see is that companies actually start to optimize for, okay, hey, what kind of impact can we have with this budget that we have? And if you would then actually invest that in a solution like direct air capture, which you can clearly see the path that has been on for the last few years, it's hugely impactful, and that's definitely a story that you can tell.
Brian, do you think there's ways that suppliers can kind of shift their strategies to be more successful in this kind of new political environment that we're in? Julius was kind of talking about this argument that direct air capture it fits the narrative of energy dominance, and do you agree with that?
I don't know if it's a narrative of energy dominance, but I do think it kind of, if we can show these great examples of how these things are actually part of the industrial landscape of any country, not just the US, but I think that does help. I think there is a bit of an unfortunate perception of what, sort of all these carbon dioxide removal technologies are, and it kind of fits into this green space, and it's kind of, whatever. And I think one of the things we've been trying to show is this is actually an industrial revolution, unlike one that we've seen since probably the, 40s and 50s maybe. And so if you can get people kind of on that boat to show that this is a growing industry, and this is, it's steel, it's iron workers, it's funny, we try to almost avoid that stuff when we talk about these things because we don't want to talk about steel and concrete and industry, but the truth of the matter is I think one of the things that kind of keeps people away from this is thinking that it's actually in some ways destroying those industries. And keep in mind, there's a lot of people in this world, in this country in particular, who rely on those industries to put food on the table and to pay their mortgage and whatever. And so I think if we can start to show that there's actually this massive opportunity to grow an industry and create jobs and do all the things that you want to do from a policy perspective, and the current administration and any administration really, then it actually is very supportive. And so I do think, and I know you guys do this, but finding ways to interact with administrations. I realize the current one is tough to do that with right now, but finding ways to interact with policymakers and governments, not just in the US, but around the world. And again, I know you do it, but I think it's actually a very important angle to show that we need more of the action to come sort of holistically, not just from companies, but also from the public sector. And so I think that is useful. I just want to make one quick point on something that we were talking about before. One of the things we've done to sort of maintain our focus on DAC as, yes, one of the most expensive things, is we created an economic framework that we make decisions in now. And so we target a price per ton for each one of our scopes of emissions. And what that helps us do is sort of what I was saying before. If you can find a solution that's relatively lower dollar per ton, it still allows you to invest in the higher dollar per ton stuff and maintain your budget. And so what we've done is we've turned carbon removal not into something we do, because it's the right thing to do. We do it because it's the right thing to do for JP Morgan. And so we've created that narrative internally. We've set a budget for it. And the idea is we've made it a part of the way we do business. So it's not this sort of like side piece, marginal sort of work that we do. It is part of the way we operate as a company now. And that has been very helpful in sort of getting operating committee and senior leaders to understand that this is just part of the deal. This is what we do now. And so I think that's helped us be able to sort of buy across the spectrum.
We talked a little bit a minute ago about kind of like how do direct air capture companies get on your radar, find you guys. Julius, I want to ask you the opposite question. How do you get more buyers? How are you finding that new people are coming to the table? What's bringing them to you?
I'm going to take notes.
Yeah, no, you need to be creative, right? I think we as a company have also evolved in the sense that I think the key thing is that you're pitching to large corporations, okay, you're going to hit price X in 2040 or 2050, and if they feel like they don't actually benefit from that early investment, then it's a very difficult pitch to actually to get them at the table, where you tell them, okay, hey, you need to pay this premium right now, so that others that come in 10 years' time can actually get it at a much cheaper cost. So I think it's finding an agreement that works for them, and be creative in what you can offer them in terms of contracting structures, payments, etc. I think that's definitely where we have matured as an organization. And also we realize that's what the market wants, and we need to adapt to what the market is currently willing to pay, and therefore get these agreements over the line. It's absolutely incremental that we do that as a company, and therefore we need to tailor to that to their specific, let's say, capabilities right now.
We were talking a little bit backstage about the sales process for buying direct air capture, and Julius and Brian were kind of talking about how it can take many, many months to get one of these contracts kind of over the finish line. And I'm wondering if that, are there benefits to doing that way? Do you see it, should we be moving towards more of a standardized contract, and how far away are we from that?
What I will say to this is I think for a lot of companies that do procure CDR for the first time, it is an entirely new thing, and also their lawyers, they have to be upskilled and they have to understand, okay, what is it that I'm actually buying? So the contract that they see, they have now, ordinarily they haven't seen something like this before, and therefore it's really in the beginning, it's making them understand, okay, so what is this purchase, and what is this service, and what does it really entail? As Brian and I were speaking about, the commercial part is fairly easy. The actual nitty-gritty details then of the language, it's where you can get lost quite fast. But I think there's also ways to counter this, and what we as a company have now seen that, okay, ordinarily or previously it would take maybe 9 to 12 months even to sign an agreement like this. But if you work in sort of sprint models or sprint sections where you really get down to business, you can do it in under 4 weeks, and we have proven that it is possible.
And just to add, like a shout out to Frontier and to others who are not just moving money to the space, but I've been always really struck by how open people are with some of the processes. Frontier released like annotated versions of the contracts they use, etc. And I just think anything that we as buyers can do to encourage other buyers to make it easier to help that. And I guess the same true for suppliers. Anything you can do to make it easy for buyers who are new to something and are probably a one-person sustainability team with a lot of things to figure out is a really, really important step.
I was just going to say, the thing that we were talking about a lot back there was this idea of like who owns the liability, and I think that has been the biggest challenge. And you know, I think if you could find a way, we talk about a lot of things that keep buyers away. I think there's, in my view, a false perception that like if price just like becomes a lot lower, that suddenly all these buyers will show up. I don't know if that's the case necessarily. This is still voluntary, and if you haven't been able to make the pitch to sort of move into this space at all, there are solutions that are much lower priced than direct air capture or other things. So if you're not in this space yet, I don't know if price is really the reason why, but I think some of it comes down to liability. Like who's on the hook for this thing? We don't understand the industry. What are they actually doing? I think for a lot of people, again, who are sort of a couple of concentric circles away from this room, they're sort of like, this feels like magic. Like it feels like smoke and mirrors. Like you're doing what? You're taking air out of air? Like how does that work? Like I think if you can sort of find a way to de-risk it for the buyer, and I don't mean the buyer as in like the sustainability person who sort of already understands this stuff enough, for the buyer, the decision maker who's writing the check, I think that would be really useful if we could find a way to de-risk it. And I know we talk a lot about insurance. I don't know if that's the answer or not yet, to be honest, but we need to find a way for liability to be managed and for people just to know if something goes wrong, God forbid something goes wrong or there's leakage or whatever happens, they're not going to be on a headline. I think that's like the concern right now is like if a bad thing happens, like your company is immediately, you know, on a headline somewhere as a bad actor, and that's not the intention of any of the purchases, right? Greenwashing to me is like the most hilarious term. Why would I spend millions of dollars on something I don't have to do to claim something I don't have to claim? There's no reason to do it. So I find it interesting that that's been sort of the attack on companies who are trying to lean in, but.
Does anyone have any ideas for how to solve this liability problem? I mean, it seems like that is a really big hurdle for buyers.
So I have one, but it requires me to do more. But I think banks have an interesting role to play in this conversation, right? So beyond the fact that we already play a role as a broker in multiple markets, beyond the fact that we all have millions of clients, depending on the banks that we are, beyond the fact that most clients trust their bank. I would say pretty much every client trusts their bank. So you sort of already have that. You sort of have a conversation to have already. I think from a liability perspective, not that we would put our balance sheets against this necessarily, but we have the ability to sort of build pools and solutions and stuff like that. I think someone should manage, like as an example, in the nature-based space, someone should manage buffer pools. The fact that we just take 10% of every ton of carbon removed and just like throw it in a pool somewhere and just like assume something bad's gonna happen and then we just leave it there forever is like a terrible idea. Find ways to use those buffer pools to solution some of the liability risks that are happening in these contracts. And again, that's nature-based, but I think if somebody can manage that, that would be interesting. If someone can say, listen, tell me what your criteria are and what your price point is, and I'll build you a solution and guarantee you that it will happen. And if something goes wrong, I will take that on. I will manage that and find ways to backstop that, either through, you know, other funding sources or some type of new reinsurance or something like that. I think that's how this stuff starts to move. But without that, I'm not sure who's going to do it. And I think the struggles we run into is with the developing insurance industries. They don't have the capital to really insure at large scale that they need to be able to. So they're smaller bites that are being taken right now. It doesn't feel like a solution yet.
Can I turn the question around on you? Like this is not prepared, so I'm sorry. I'm curious from your perspective, like thinking with a media lens as a journalist. What do you think companies should be thinking about? Because everyone is terrified of the negative headline. Everyone is terrified of like, either people don't know what direct air capture is, or they're thinking, so we've got kind of two things we need to push forward from a narrative perspective. One is if you're trying to do something, you maybe shouldn't be punished if it goes wrong. And two is just getting more people aware of it. I mean, I'm just curious if you see anyone doing a really great job telling those stories in a way that connects.
I'm
asking, sorry, I shouldn't have done that.
You're asking if there are any journalists doing a good job covering direct air
No,
capture?
I'm asking if there are any like, do you see any buyers or suppliers like telling the story in a way that you think cuts through to a wider audience and has people less scared of like, what if I'm suddenly in a headline because this isn't delivered and I've talked about it?
I don't know. I mean, I think the obvious answer is the frontiers of the world that are like being really transparent, like you said earlier, and kind of sharing all the data that they're gathering as they go, and talking to the media a lot about what they're doing. I think also the former Department of Energy staff who was working on this stuff was really great and really put out a lot of really helpful materials for the public. But Adam, I gotta
I'm sorry, I shouldn't
turn
have
this back around on you. So, in the philanthropy space, like, how are you expecting this new political environment to kind of affect demand? You know, if there is an economic slowdown, what happens to Terraset?
That's a big question. And I don't know the answer to it, right? Like, normally, logically, I would say to you, well, when something gets cut by government or when work is not being delivered that people care about, that's often when philanthropy steps up. That's when I would expect us to get more donations from people who see, oh, this is no longer a priority here, but I care about it. Maybe I'll increase the amount that I'm giving to Terraset to purchase carbon removal. And the challenge in the like very current landscape is so many things are being cut. I'm not sure that logic will follow through. Like, if you're donating to us and you're also funding education, you're seeing education budgets cut as well as what's happening in climate. You know, so I think it's really hard to predict. We have had funders say to us already, like, we would do this with you. We would give you money to purchase carbon removal, but we need to reallocate because USAID has cut this and we need to move our money there. That might be a nice, like, it's not you, it's me brush off, but it's a conversation that you know, I wasn't hearing 6 months ago that does now come through from some of the larger foundations. I think all we can do on that is the same as I would have said before. Like, I'm a big co-benefits guy in our storytelling. Like, if you are convincing philanthropists, large foundations, etc., this is something they should care about, I think that also has to include the and it creates jobs, or, you know, depending on your methodology, your situation, and the renewable energy company powering this DAC place is indigenous owned, and this improves soil quality, this improves water, like whatever the thing is for your particular project, methodology, etc. That story has to come through even more strongly now, because people are having to care about a lot of things, and you want them to see that this is part of the solution.
I'm going to just ask one more question, and then we'll have maybe 10 minutes or so for audience questions. So if anyone wants to ask one, there's a microphone right up here. You can come line up. So I was hoping that by today we would have some news to talk about. The Science Based Targets Initiative is supposed to release their new net zero standard any day now. And I think there's a lot of hope in the carbon removal community that is going to be pretty big. They're going to, you know, for the first time, potentially tell companies that they should be buying carbon removal and kind of how much and when. So Julius, you know, how much of a game changer is that? Is that something that people in the industry are just sort of waiting, like, oh, once that happens, then we'll be in the clear?
No, I think that would be a bit too easy to say. I think we would all hope that that would happen, but I don't think that is the reality of the situation. I am fairly positive, though. I think it should actually, of what I've heard, it should come out tomorrow. The integration of short-term removal targets should be there, and I think this can be hugely, hugely helpful to all of us. In terms of further market development, what I'm seeing, as I said, I mean, despite everything that's going on and despite everything that we talked about, I actually am still positive in the sense that if you compare, for example, last year to this year, we as Climeworks are participating in a number of RFPs and RFIs that were launched with like CDR specific, but also DAC only. And I feel that's hugely, hugely positive. I feel that the market is maturing. I feel that companies are now actually looking, okay, how can we operationally integrate this? And with that operational integration, the SBTI is obviously hugely helpful in actually having them sort of solidify their sustainability strategy even further by having to integrate these removal targets.
This is kind of for all of you. Nobody's come up to ask questions, so I'll just keep it going. Looking into the future, you know, in the kind of near, like short term and medium term, what are the things like this new SBTI standard? What are the sort of drivers that you see could really kind of be pivot points in driving demand for this?
To me still?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's why I love my job, but it's also why it's quite difficult, is in finding that angle, right? And it's for each and every company, genuinely, it's different. Why JPM does certain things, for example, in another large organization, they can be motivated by entirely different things. So it's not, my answer isn't hugely helpful, but I do genuinely, like, we as Climeworks, we've now actually also pivoted into offering portfolios which do not only cater to direct air capture, but also other removal solutions. And what we've really found over this journey, over the last, let's say, 1.5 years, is that there is no one-size-fits-all. You really have to sit down with these people. You really have to sit down in that organization and finding out, why are you doing this? And then, I mean, building on that, you first have to obviously establish your champions, and then build that network internally, and then find out, okay, hey, how do we move further from here?
I mean, one thing that has not come up yet in this panel is, you know, when I speak with people in the carbon removal industry, people often talk about compliance markets, and that's the future, that's how this is gonna scale. You know, when do you see that happening, and what can the industry do to bring about that future faster, especially right now where that we don't seem anywhere close to that in the US?
I think, I mean, the US, I mean, just purely speaking of compliance and speaking of politics, I think what the US, I mean, previously did with the IRA versus what Europe is doing with the ETS is completely different, right? The US is spending big money versus Europe. I mean, we're working on developing this on the compliance market, developing regulation. I think both are incredibly important. But yes, I think right now, in this situation, we are looking at corporates to drive this forward. There is first signs of governments and countries wanting to procure CDR directly, but I still think it's, I mean, as we all know, it's fairly limited. So I think in the short term, it's still the corporates that need to drive this market forward, but hopefully in the future, as you're saying, a compliance market will exist, and that, of course, will make all our lives much easier.
Brian, was there something you wanted to add to that?
I think I was still thinking a little bit of your previous question, sort of what do we need to see kind of thing, and I was just gonna, hope is never a strategy, but I was just gonna mention that what is not in any model or any analysis or anything that I've seen, rightly so, is that human ingenuity has like always been the thing that like came through when we never thought we'd find a solution. You know, like we thought computers were gonna be the size of this room forever because Moore's law said they had to be. And like we've regularly found ways to have that. And I think there is something that will happen in this space, like in many industries, if enough people care about it as they do, to sort of be the step function we need to see to move things forward. Until then, I actually think it will fall a lot on private industries to be the bellwether in the storm we are currently in the middle of. And I think they will do that. I think the companies who have been leaning in will continue to do so. I hope some new ones come through, but I do think there's like some missing piece, and I can't figure out what it is yet, but as long as smart people keep trying to figure it out, we'll get there.
Let's take a question from the audience.
Hi guys, Eric Ping from Sargent Mondi. The last few months we've seen, you know, a lot of news about banks exiting the Net Zero Banking Alliance. And Brian, I was hoping you could maybe provide a little bit of context or color behind how JPM's exit from NZBA impacts your work this year or your strategy behind your work.
Yeah, what doesn't, but I think what's very important about groups like that, SBTI, NZBA, choose your acronym, companies join those things because those frameworks fit the moral focus of the company. We already were working on, we already had Paris line financing targets. We already had a $2.5 trillion commitment to underwrite sustainable development. We already, trying to remember if we had done the $200 million CDR commitment or not yet, but the point is, we didn't do it because of NZBA, right? So we continue to press forward on all of those things. Quite honestly, it's a large organization that wasn't actually getting a whole lot new done, and it takes up a lot of time and energy from companies to do it, and it unfortunately puts a target on your back for no good reason. And so I think most US banks looked at it and said, look, we want to keep getting this work done, and the way we're going to make the most progress is by not being associated necessarily with some other acronym, and so let's just keep pressing forward. Banks all do work together on many, many topics for good reason, and this is not different.
That's great to hear. Thanks.
And by the way, let's also note that now that the European banks are fully in control of NZBA, there's now talk about them agreeing that 1.5 degrees should be more like 2 to 2.2 degrees. So I think we're seeing a general softening, and I'm not to say that that's a reason why anyone made any decisions, but we're seeing a softening and a sort of a pragmatism come into this industry that actually is very important. Right, again, I think hope is not a strategy, so we need business imperatives to start coming through and drive the change.
Yeah, I really appreciate the insight.
Thank you.
Next question.
Hi, hi everybody. I'm Art Burtis, and I'm founder and CEO of Solar Air Tech LLC. My question to you is, if concentrated solar power and airflow convection apparatus can be designed to be able to drop the cost of direct air capture to $100 a ton or below, do you feel that would be a game changer on the entire market?
I'll start. I think it would be a game changer. I'm still not convinced that it would bring in all of these brand new companies. I do think it would get people to move, but I don't know that there would be a movement in mass. And again, I think the issue generally, and I might have said it at this conference a year and a half ago or whenever it was, the word voluntary is the biggest problem in this market, right? And I think that is the biggest struggle. I do think those technologies matter. We do need to, that is the ingenuity I'm talking about, right? We need to have those things sort of injected. I'm not sure it actually is the step function that will make the whole market move, but you'll get a new cadre of buyers for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I can also maybe chime into that. Obviously, I think everybody wants to get to that $100 a ton, but right now it's not really based on anything. And I think with different levels of maturity come different levels of realism. We as a company, our price estimations were entirely different 8 years ago than the ones that we currently have. So I don't think anybody here has a crystal ball. I think it would be hugely impactful, obviously, for the industry if we do get to that $100 a ton, but really a lot needs to happen in order to get there. And I think, as you're saying with the solar industry, I mean, we as direct air capture, I feel, need to go through that same trajectory. And how did EV and solar eventually get there? It was with government support and government help. And I think if that really kicks in, I think then we can actually also get closer to that number.
Thank you, and I'm confident we can meet the need. Thank you.
Thanks, Art.
I think we do have time for one more, so let's go ahead.
One more. Hi, everyone. I'm Coleman White, Verified Carbon. Thank you guys for being here. It's a great panel. So you, Brian, this is more directed at you, but you talked about the co-benefit from being a buyer, but also as a project financier. And we've spoken with a couple of different institutional investors from a project financing perspective, and they're putting together carbon teams, but they're not exactly diving in as project financiers. And can you speak on the state of that in terms of institutional investors?
I can tell you some of the challenges we've faced, also something we were talking about actually backstage. So one of the interesting issues you run into with project finance and carbon capture is the project developer who's coming and asking for the finance is not the ultimate end owner of the ton of CO2, right? That's a transportation and storage partner. So you are capturing the CO2 and you're putting it in a tank, and then you're passing it off. There's a chain of custody, and now it sits with the TNS partner. They're responsible to pipe it, God knows how many miles, to a well site, inject it into the ground, make sure it stays there, and manage that site for a long period of time, let's say 25 to 50 years. That project financier does not have any claim over the TNS partner because they're working with the project and not the TNS partner. So it's an interesting, we've talked to our project finance guys about this. They sort of think of it as like the reverse of a natural gas plant, if you will, where you're piping in the commodity and then the end use of it is being used at the project site. Whereas here, you're collecting the thing and all the work you're doing ultimately relies on another partner. And so it's just an interesting liability gap that we've seen, and we haven't yet found a way to cover it. Obviously, the other big issue we run into is you're mostly talking about startups who are looking for project finance, who don't have balance sheets or not large enough ones to, underwrite. And so that's a big challenge, right? Like, this has been, I think, the big finance conversation we continue to have in this industry is, we look at this like the core VC model, and we're like, but this is how tech got off the ground. This is how it happens, right? And it's like, but tech was a very capital light industry, and it didn't require massive project finance like this until those companies were already in pretty good shape. Go ask a tech company right now how much money they have in the balance sheet. It's pretty easy to see. Guess what they're doing with data centers? They're all doing project finance, but it's cheap money because they have the cash in the bank. And these smaller carbon capture companies can't do that. And so it's, the cost of capital is going to increase the cost as well. We haven't found the right solution. I think ultimately the answer will come from smart people getting in a room and identifying issues and then working through them. That's how we've always solved the problems, but we just haven't gotten the right group together yet, and we just haven't figured out how to solve it. It is hard, very hard.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're gonna have to leave it there, but thank you so much to all of our panelists. And they'll be around afterward if you have more questions.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you.
Thank you.